Hey everyone, welcome to Live Your Language, tips and inspiration for your bilingual life. I'm Stephanie, a PhD student in second language acquisition and a mother to a child that I'm raising bilingually. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite books on bilingualism and bilingual parenting. It's called The Bilingual Edge by Kendall King and Alison Mackey. So as you guys might know, I recently have decided to introduce Spanish to my son, and so I've been looking for different ways, different ideas and inspiration and tips just for how to get started. I actually had this book for a really long time. I read it even before my son was born, but I just thought now was a really great time to take it back out and look through it and see what I can learn. So one of the things I really like about this book is it's well organized and really easy to just go in and find the section that's most relevant to you without having to read the whole book. So today I'm going to be talking all about my 10 takeaways that I got from chapter 6, which is all about how to best promote a language at home. The first point I want to talk about is the gradual scaffolding process that happens when you're raising kids, especially in a second language. As children become better communicators, their caregivers gradually give them more and more complicated and sophisticated speech. I really liked reading this because it reminded me that as non-native speakers especially, you don't have to know everything all up front, that you just have to stay a step or two ahead of your children. So if you're not speaking yet at college level, writing essays and that sort of thing in your non-native language, you shouldn't worry if your kids are really young because you still know more than they do, and as they become more sophisticated in their speech, you will also become more sophisticated as you keep up with them. The second takeaway I really got from this was something that I've heard a lot, but I just love to hear it again, and that is what matters most is the interactions that children have with their caregivers, not necessarily what they're taught. So at the earlier stages, it's really about acquiring a language naturally, not necessarily about grammar and vocabulary lists and that sort of thing. What really matters is what they're exposed to in their everyday lives and what sorts of interactions they have with their caregivers. The third key takeaway is that raising a bilingual child, especially if you're the source of input, doesn't have to take any extra time. A lot of parents will say that they just don't have the time to raise children to be bilingual, but actually bilingualism and adding a second language complements your busy life rather than competes with all of the everyday activities that you have going on. So instead of having to worry about squeezing an extra thing in, you can just focus on having your everyday busy lives happen in that second language. The fourth thing I want to talk about is that parents should try to incorporate the second language in as many aspects of life as they possibly can. They go on to say that even parents who haven't mastered the language and just know bits and pieces can still use those bits and pieces of the language with the child. For example, they talk about one father who used going up and down the stairs as the time that he would count in Spanish with this child. So it doesn't have to be the big things, the little things add up. The next tip is so important that I'm actually going to read it word for word, and I put a star next to it in my book. Majority language parents should not worry too much about speaking the language absolutely perfectly or with a non-native-like accent. And there's lots of evidence that language learners can benefit greatly from interaction in the second language, even if it's not coming from the mouth of a native speaker of that language. Just to reiterate again, especially at the earlier ages, it's way more important to have meaningful interaction than to be completely perfect. So if that's what's really holding you back, you should just go for it. We're all gonna make some mistakes sometimes, and you can perfect your accent later on. The important thing is that you are starting early and that these are meaningful interactions. The next tip I want to talk about is the importance of reading aloud. They cite a study in which children were given a book every time they visited the doctor's office. And then at the end of the study, the children were measured on their vocabulary and then compared to other toddlers that were of the same age group that were not given books. And they found that reading aloud was actually linked to higher vocabulary scores than their peers who had not received the books. But the part that I think is really interesting that they mention is that reading aloud actually seemed to have more effect on the child's vocabulary than actual time spent in conversation did. I thought this was really interesting and super important for those of us who may not feel super confident in the language that we're introducing to our child. So it just showed me, especially as I'm thinking about introducing Spanish, that it's a lot more important, especially now, to focus my efforts on reading aloud. The next takeaway that I took from this book was a study that they talked about discussing how much exposure is enough. They found that as little as 20% of your child's waking hours will produce a productive bilingual. In other words, as long as children were exposed to this language for 1/5 of their waking hours, they were able to actively produce this language. Keep in mind that this is the minimum amount of exposure needed to create a productive bilingual, and that the children who were exposed to this language less than 20% of the time were hesitant to speak at all. The next tip that I thought was really important concerns the one parent, one language method, and that is that even with the one parent, one language method, you can still get a child who is a passive bilingual. I actually have a previous video, which I will link down in the show notes below, that talks all about a really great study by Aniek de Houwer, a Belgian researcher who studies bilingualism in children, and she goes into depth on which situations are actually more likely to produce productive bilinguals. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. When I heard about the study, it was really eye-opening and motivating for me to really recommit myself to making sure that I use as much French as possible with my son. Along the same lines with this part in the book that talks about one parent, one language, is a lot of fathers are confused as to why their children don't seem to be picking up their language. They suggest doing a language exposure inventory. So taking a closer look at which languages, active and passive, the child is exposed to every day. You know, the parents thought that they were giving 50-50 exposure to the child, but when they actually did this inventory, it turned out that the father's language actually had a lot less exposure, specifically with the solo time they spent with their child. If that's the case for you, try and identify if you truly are giving 50% of your time or 20% the minimum to your child. The next is something that I say a lot on my channel, but I'm gonna say it again, and that is kids really benefit from live human interaction. There's really no substitute for it. So just when you start to think that TV and interactive games can replace actual speakers, even you, if you're not a native speaker, please think again. There's really no substitute for a human-to-human interaction. Okay, everyone, those are my top 10 takeaways from the Bilingual Edge by Alison, Mackey, and Kendall King. If you found these interesting, I would really encourage you to pick up a copy of the book because it has really great tidbits in there and I couldn't cover it in just one video. Alright, I hope you found this video useful. If you have not yet done so, please don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss any more videos, and it really helps my channel to grow. So thanks again, and I will see you in the next video.